We are honored today to have our new Superintendent of Instruction for the state of Arizona, Superintendent John Huppenthal, and he's going to speak for about 20 or 30 minutes on his vision as he sees it, as he's laying it out for the state of Arizona. And then we'll do a Q&A session for about 15 minutes. So I do have some questions that we've already gathered, but I will be taking questions from the audience as well. So please enjoy.
Thank you. Well, Angel, thank you for the invitation, and also thank you for the great work that your and Sam DeGange's group is doing over here. We don't go a week down in my office without hearing something about something new and exciting happening at SkySong. Just as a little bit of background, I am all in the office all of a couple weeks down at the Superintendent of Public Instruction, but my background goes back quite a bit further. I've been in elected office for 25 years, was on the City Council in Chandler for 8 years, and then in the legislature for 18. But my real passion isn't politics, it's organizations. For whatever reason, right out of college, I got my master's degree at ASU, and a guy by the name of Mark Edwards came in one day in our industrial policies class and started talking about 360-degree review. And the concept absolutely fascinated me, and I eventually started going into progressively deeper levels into a lot of different theories of organizations and why great organizations are different than the ones that aren't so good, and really took an intense interest in every year when the Fortune magazine articles came out that listed the top 500 companies and which ones were the best managed. I'd always peel off the top 10 and then for a year just study the top 10 and the bottom 10 to see what they were doing differently, and discovered a few things that aren't part of the common nomenclature for how people think about organizations, and also some real fundamental principles. I also noticed that the Berkshire Hathaway companies, I felt like they had really discovered those things too at a very deep level, and it was core to the success that they had. So when I got into education, the one thing one approach that I took a little bit different is I view the classroom as an organization, and that's a very challenging thing for people to do. And the thing that I tell people is if you go back in time, for whatever reason, or for a variety of complex reasons actually, education froze in time right around 1810. You know, if you took a 747 back to 1810, people would go into total cultural shock. And if you saw an ox cart going down the road with a bale of hay, you'd be a little bit shocked to see that too. But that classroom transports nicely across time. You'd be very comfortable going into a classroom of 1810, and those students would be very comfortable coming into a classroom nowadays. And it is something that our parents experienced, our grandparents, our great-grandparents. It's a common denominator. So we're very comfortable with it, and in fact, we get very agitated when we see efforts to change it. Well, let me suggest to you that a decade from now, we are going to see radical transformation of that classroom. It is going to be something that we can't even fathom at this point. The same way, if we were in the 1800s, we couldn't fathom a 747 landing on the local dirt road. So, and I'll try to give you a little bit of a sense. Now, there's a risk to doing the vision thing, a real risk. You know, Sam Goddard, when he was working on rocketry, when he finally got successful and he was blasting these rockets off and they were all stable, he was an extraordinary mind, an incredibly extraordinary mind to be able to figure that out and make that work. It was so extraordinary that he not only knew the rocketry, but he knew what rocketry meant for the future of society. He could envision that too. And he started to talk about it. He started to talk about people going to the moon. In his mind, he could already visualize all the systems. He became a national laughingstock. People thought he was an idiot. But some people listened. So when I lay out a vision here, you'll have to make the decision of whether I'm a visionary or whether I'm an idiot. But the thing that you've observed in other organizations as you went from the 1800s to modern times is the boundaries that people had previously, that they thought when you went past those boundaries you would end up with chaos. We broke through those boundaries, and systems stayed stable as you broke through those. It would have been inconceivable to have a company with hundreds of thousands of employees back in the early 1800s and for us to view that as stable. And we now would view the idea of a school having 50,000 students as being incomprehensible, a chaotic mess. But let me suggest to you that these schools will not only be not chaotic, but they will be more stable, they will be higher functioning, and there will be a strong desire to get into those schools. And the complexity that's involved behind that is things that's hard for us to understand because it's outside the realm of what we've understood in the classroom historically. We get just a little bit of a glimmer from that. The world's largest elementary school is a school in Taiwan. They're at 10,000 students. And you get just a little glimmer when you study them of what's coming. They're at 10,000 students because parents actively seek them out. And that's how they grew to 10,000 students. They'd be larger if there were sufficient transportation systems to bring in more students. They have an incredible reputation for academic gains. And as you go inside that school, you just get a glimmer of what's coming here in the United States. That's coming here, and it's going to come to Arizona. And it's going to come to Arizona likely first anywhere else in the nation. And the reason that it's going to come to Arizona is we have this incredible choice environment. So we allow for a lot of experiments. When you have a monopoly environment where your students have to go there, people are totally intolerant of change or intolerant of something different. So as long as the broad mass of people can pick that same thing that they've always experienced, then you can engage in experiments out here without disrupting the fabric of society. It's when you try to engage in change and something different of that nonstop thing that you get into deep trouble. And as the education system's tried to do that at various times through history, it's always relapsed back into that same steady thing. Once you allow a lot of change, something else happens. People begin to realize in this modern day and age we have numbers, we can calculate, and we can see that this experiment over there is getting higher academic gains than this tried and true thing that we've always experienced and we're comfortable with. And we are now just seeing a glimmer of that here in Arizona. There's a company called National Assessment. It did perhaps the most scientific measures of academic gain that have ever been done in the history of education, and they ranked 1,300 plus schools in Arizona. And as soon as I got that ranking, I leaped in my car and drove on down to Yuma to take a look at Carpe Diem, #1 school on the ranking. In theory, it had the highest academic gains in the state. Now, when I went inside, immediately it was a totally different experience. It was nothing like our traditional thing that we all experience. Literally right from going in the door. When I went through the door, an RTF detector overhead took attendance. So when the students had all gone into the school, the attendance had already been taken. They already knew who was absent or who was tardy, and they were already on the phone calling those parents. But more importantly than that, it was completely a technology-driven school. They had hundreds of carousels out there, computers that students were acting on, and they were essentially using homeschool software, but in a classroom environment. So they have hundreds of students on that. So you have to think about that for a second. What's going on out there? Are there some fundamental principles that we can identify? And if you think about our traditional, tried and true classroom, it has every student at the same place, moving at the same speed. So the teacher's lecturing, all the students are at that one place where the teacher is lecturing. So now at Carpe Diem, they've created an environment where every student can be at a different place, moving at a different speed. It's fundamentally different design principle. So now the aux cart has a 2-speed transmission. And it can move on down the road a little bit faster. the real gains, and this is what I'm so interested in organizationally, come from understanding what is happening in the educational environment. In the educational environment, we're in the business of permanent memories. And we do 27 million measurements a year in Arizona, all for the purpose of largely measuring temporary memories. And as a result, we haven't developed a higher level culture that understands that we're really in the business of measuring permanent memories. And so we get this tremendous, enormous amount of feedback on temporary memories. These kids know what it takes to pass the test on Friday, and then when we look at the research, we see how much of this melts away and actually sticks. So we really haven't gone to this higher level culture that understands profoundly we're in the permanent memory business. But when you're in a competitive environment, you start to get down to having a profound knowledge of the business you're really in. If you're going to stack up year after year higher academic gains, the way you conduct your classroom has to be permanent memories. So you have to understand fundamentally what goes on in here, what makes the brain decide that it's going to store something permanently. And the Gallup organization has done some really fascinating research. They've been plunging into this over the last decade, and they have come up with a group of measures that are highly correlated with this concept of permanent memory. They have one, they call it hope, but what hope is, as they define it, is a vision for future and energy towards that vision. Hugely correlated with success on a whole variety of measures. Also hugely correlated with a whole variety of ills, likelihood of getting pregnant as a single teenager, a lot of likelihood of drug abuse, those kind of things. They have another one that's critically important. It's called engagement. Engagement is hugely correlated with academic gains. When they measure that, they find that 50% of our students are engaged. So think about that. That's where we are in the United States right now. 50% of our students are actually tied into the process that's at hand. And the last one is a measure of well-being, but a sort of measure of day-to-day quality in the classroom. Was I treated with respect yesterday? Did I learn something interesting? Did I smile or laugh a lot yesterday? In other words, was I emotionally engaged? Was I treated with a way that was going to enhance, move away from alienation to that process of engagement? So let's go back to the classroom and try to understand what that means. In this Carpe Diem environment, we have every student moving at the same speed at a different place. Obviously, that's going to be a better design than every student moving at the same speed at the same place. You're going to move faster. The next step in this cultural development is going to be creating environments where you move to 100% engagement, you move to 100% well-being, and you move to these very high levels of active pursuit of the academic mission. And that's where some of the organizational stuff comes in. Matter of fact, we have an experiment going on right now that Angel and Sam are helping us with. But one of the things we find in these high-performance organizations that is completely lacking in the low ones, and you have to think about this for a second. We're talking about the UPSs, the Federal Express, the Procter & Gamble's, all of these very high-level organizations. There's no exceptions to this principle. It's an absolute. And we also found that this concept was completely lacking in the bottom 10. Not a single one did it. And what this principle is, that every single one of these high-performance organizations, and these are the very best. I mean, you're talking, when you consider the number of companies in the United States, you're talking well over 6 standard deviations from the mean in terms of their long-term performance. Every single one of those measures the total performance of the organization and makes that powerfully important. No exception to that rule. When we looked at the bottom 10 of that, and these are companies that made it to the Fortune 500, not a single one abided by that principle. The state librarian told me, she said, we can search for those companies at the bottom by using the word layoff. So the question is, what we see in the classroom, this structure that we've been comfortable with for hundreds of years looks exactly like the bottom 10. We measure all the individual pieces and make that important, but we don't ever measure how the classroom is doing. So the tests that we've been running is we've been making it powerfully important to this group of students as to how the class is performing, and we're doing immediate feedback. And we believe we have Carpe Diem here, #1 out of 1,300, so they're in the top 1/10 of 1% in academic gains nationwide. What we believe is that we can take that Carpe Diem model and spring it forward much more dramatically. And in our initial tests, we're getting knock your socks off kind of results with student engagement, student motivation, and also the academic gains. But we got some more work to do on that, and so that's going to continue on down the path. But if we believe that based on this organizational stuff that we see in the private sector at the adult level, we can duplicate that at the student level. And we can turn them into an organization. And we see all kinds of aspects of that when we examine the individual behavior of these students. The level of excitement, the level of intensity, the level of joy. When they talk about, did I have laugh, did I smile a lot? You know, when those kids set successive records in there as a team, it was like a team had scored the winning football goal in the Super Bowl. So our initial work on this looks very promising. So we see this stuff organizationally going on. We believe we can outdo Carpe Diem. So, and if you can, the nice thing about this is it doesn't take a super skilled teacher. If you look at all the research going on nationally right now, it really talks about the teacher being the critical element. The excellent teachers, the top 25% get superior academic gains. Everything is people driven. There's a challenge when success depends on getting excellent people, because in the end, all we have are average people. You know, and half of our people that we have to deal with are below average. It's just the nature of the beast. So what we've been looking for is things that are systematic. Now, let me stop and assure you all, those part of you that have now concluded that this guy is nuts, that we aren't neglecting the traditional models either. And let me just go down very briefly what we're doing in that regard. The RAND Corporation has done a very sophisticated analysis of all the states in the nation, ranking all the states, the quality of their education. We're looking very closely at all of those states that are in the top 10 there and the bottom 10 to see what we can garner from their policies. Through the school chiefs organization, I'm working with them to bring stuff into Arizona. We're doing the same thing with our school districts. We have a school district down by Tucson called Vail, highest academic gains in the state. They're doing a whole lot of innovative things, partnerships. They have different approaches to managing the classroom. We're spreading that out, and we're going to give them credit for what they're doing and put more of a spotlight on them at the school district level so we can get more school districts duplicating their results. That's getting the maximum mileage out of our current automobile. So we're doing a lot of things and a lot of endeavors, but above all, we really want to work on breakthrough because we think it has the promise of springboarding Arizona to #1. Another interesting aspect to it, it also opens up the potential to give teachers pay increases and to drive our teachers' pay higher, because with this technology, you can now get economies of scale for the very first time in the classroom, and you can afford to pay your teachers more. There's a number of charter schools that have opened up this model, and as we can demonstrate that you get both higher academic gains and greater teacher pay, you get this kind of virtuous cycle going to get us out of a cycle that's been anything but virtuous in our education system. With that, I'm going to close it out there, and thank you all for being here and open it up for any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Well, thank you. That was a wonderful discussion, and I would like to go ahead and open up to the floor for any questions from the audience. Is there anyone that has any questions or comments? Yes.
Mr. Huppenthal, thank you. I'm with Microsoft. So I work for one of those companies that has a very comprehensive performance evaluation model. And in a corporate environment, that is fed on two ends by an HR and a hiring process and a focus on competencies and development of those competencies.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other end, rewards and recognition and compensation model that drives performance. So can you talk a little bit about your vision for bringing that performance evaluation piece and influencing it with what other factors that complete that whole cycle. So can you expound on
Well,
this a little bit?
since you brought up Microsoft, I'll segue here a little bit. But Bill Gates is actually very interesting. I've followed him very closely. We have the Gates Foundation. They have spent $2.5 billion over a decade of action. And to me, he's fascinating because they've had a number of really big initiatives that they have engaged in. The Small Schools Initiative. They recently brought in AIR to a really well-respected consulting company to evaluate their initiatives. And AIR, brace yourself, said that he had no impact, maybe even a little detrimental impact with the Small Schools Initiative. So it's fascinating for a number of reasons from my standpoint. So here you've had Bill Gates, who's been at the top of, when I talk with 10 best managed companies that we've followed in America, he's been at the top of one of those. And he's been actively involved here. And so after a decade, he says that his best research says he hasn't had an impact, $2.5 billion. So here I'm local hack politician who says that I can do something that Bill Gates can't. So we look very carefully inside of Microsoft to see what was going on there, to see if we get some ideas out of it. And we pulled out some of their ideas to deal with teachers. For example, one of the things they do in Microsoft is they do vertical review. So if you're a supervisor in Microsoft, you get evaluated by your subordinates. And we thought, hey, that's a very powerful technique. The principal and leadership is one of the most important factors in education. So we set up a test a decade ago, and we had the teachers evaluate the leadership. And when they started, test district was the Sedona School District, and we had 28% of the teachers rated the quality of leadership excellent. Today, they're at 64%, sort of grinding it out. Now, what's fascinating to me is the Gates Foundation has never been an advocate for these techniques in performance pay. So this is interesting because it's not only Bill Gates that hasn't been able to view education as an organization, but it's also Lou Gerstner. Think of Lou Gerstner. He was probably the most famous leader in the business world. He took IBM right from the brink of bankruptcy. There were an enormous number of people who said it was going to go into bankruptcy, 1992, and he turned them around on a dime, and now they're back to greatness. Now, a couple of the things that he did in there is he immediately put in customer satisfaction measurement systems and made that the strategic objective. And so when we looked at that, we thought, has anybody ever rewarded teachers for customer satisfaction in the education arena? And we couldn't find a single case of it, but we tested that. We immediately set up a project. Again, it was part of what we did at Sedona. We brought in the Microsoft concept of vertical review, but in addition to academics, we also measured what percentage of the parents rated the quality of education excellent. Not good, not satisfactory, excellent. That's been 26% for 40 years nationwide, and so we set that up as a measure. Said, nobody's really succeeded just focusing on academics. Let's add a little more comprehensive accountability. And when we first measured the high school, 6% of the students and 8% of the parents rated the quality of education excellent. Today, they're at 57 and 64. Decade and a quarter later, the nation, high schools have stayed at 16% flat as a pancake for, essentially 40 years. So, but again, Lou Gerstner cannot visualize education as an organization. He has been involved intensively in education for 40 years. We've studied all of his proposals. He's never advocated to do in education what he had done in IBM to help turn it around. And so we find that fascinating too.
Yeah, I'd like to support what you're saying. I talked to Lou Gerstner's people back 20 years ago and tried to find out what they're really doing, and there was nothing but the same old foundation stuff, just pouring money out there. And I've been stunned at these great minds of business that sort of deal with the future and go out there with long-range planning and transform with technology. When they turned around and looked at education, they just left all that behind, left it all on the table, and that's what they could bring. I mean,
Lou Gerstner went to a Jesuit school, very strict. And essentially what you can see, what he's tried to do is if you would just run your school like they ran my school, everything would be fine. You know, and but you know, we've been running those kind of schools and trying variations of that same old model for a long time, and it hasn't worked. What we've shown so far is at the teacher level that we can create a great environment. And we also are getting glimmers from our Sedona experiment too, that it produces something besides academic achievement. When these students, they rank 3rd in the state in advanced placement for college credit, so that's a little bit of a glimmer for us. But also, they have a high success rate when they go on to college. So what you see is there's a high correlation between GPA and SAT scores, but you have a lot of students that are in the top 10% of SAT scores that crash and burn in college. And you have a lot of students, not nearly, there is a correlation, they're in the bottom 25%, but somehow they persist in the face of adversity and they make it on through college. So what we see is students beating the odds. So we see that in creating this classroom environment, we've given them something intangible, some strength, some character, whatever, to persist and break through the odds of that correlation with academic gains. So we think but we haven't gotten the academic gains out of the Sedona experiment that we would like. And that's why we've moved this pilot project with math up there, that we're doing this. Now we're going to take this organizational stuff right down to the classroom level. Now, to really do the Sam Goddard thing, my belief is that in the end, you're going to be able to run schools with very few teachers involved in the endeavor. You're going to be able to get incredible economies of scale. And what it will look like, we will be able to double the pace of academic gains. The speed of light right now in education has been, the average nationwide is, of course, 1.0 academic years in a calendar year. The speed of light is sort of 1.5. A highly talented superintendent hires highly talented principals who hire highly talented teachers, and then he supports them, and so they can beat the numbers by about 50%. When you get to 2.0, enormously magical things happen. You just have to visualize it. We now have students at the 8th grade, a lot of the Einsteins that are out there that have engineering degrees, and they're still there. They're available to all the other students. So some incredible things start to happen. And we believe that it's fully within the concept of the mind to be able to get those kind of gains. Now, going back to the 1810 thing, what happened in education too, not only did our school freeze, but our culture in education froze too. We, in a variety of ways that it's just almost impossible for us to comprehend, reality sort of froze in place. So if you look in physics, if you went to a room full of physicists and none of them knew that F equal ma, or none of them knew that E equal mc squared, you would say, I'm not sure if they're physicists. But if you look in education, and if you look for a fundamental body of law, that fundamental body of law doesn't exist. And what that law would enable you to explain is, why does the brain form a permanent memory? E equal mc squared led in a direct path to nuclear power generation. Albert Einstein knew that it led in a direct path to the nuclear bomb, sent the letter to Roosevelt saying, get with it, guy, the Germans are working on it. He knew that an atomic bomb was coming. So just like Sam Goddard knew we would fly to the moon, he knew that E equal mc squared led to the atomic bomb. We don't have an E equals mc squared in education. When I first got the chairmanship of education in 1993, I went on a frenzied search for what are the fundamental bodies of law, and ended up research entities, you name it, ended up stone cold dead. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to be my own Galileo. I'm going to have to be my own, So I sat down and started looking through this research and saying, what is a fundamental body of law in education? So with some arrogance, I'll tell you the fundamentals of how you can analyze a situation to know that you can project out and that we will be able to get to 2.0. But the brain goes through a 3-step process to form a permanent memory. The first step is this important for my survival or not? So just through when God created us out in the Serengeti over 50 million years, a lot of things burned in just automatically, like learning spaces and travel and those kind of things that are important for survival. So we do that automatically almost without thinking. But of course, there's not much threat to life these days, so we don't really perceive much risk. So that's not really a driving entity. The second two are critically important. The second one is this information important for my group identity or not? If the information is important for my group identity, I learn it. If I'm a football player and I happen to run into a golf lesson, I may or may not take an interest in it. That information can wash right on through my brain. Another student sitting right there who's on the golf team has a whole totally different experience because this information is important for my group identity, my group membership. I'm on the golf team. Same way with the football team. That's why our little experiment of having a team score in the classroom is so critically important. Now all of a sudden I'm on a team. And we literally saw that with one of the students in the class. We had a student come in, and the first day, and I was looking at him, he leaned so far over in his desk that his head was pointing to the ground. And I thought, oh my gosh, I have an emotionally disabled student in my lab class. But when we looked at him, we realized what was going on there. He couldn't add 5 plus 4, and he's in the 4th grade. He was so humiliated by his lack of skill that he never, ever displayed it for fear of humiliation. So here, when you desperately need more practice to get ahead, here's a kid who's totally devoted to never practicing, never displaying his skill, so avoiding any kind of situation like that. So what happened was, when we got this intense thing going, there he was adding on his fingers. It may have not been the best skill display in the world, but what we realized, digit addition leads to automaticity, leads to the skills you need. By the end of the semester, he was doing 27 math problems a day. Let me assure you, if you do 27 math problems day in, day out, you're on your road to at least basic skills, if not proficiency, and maybe potentially excellence. We don't know what that trajectory could take that child. So we saw, just in real life, we saw this team thing just grip these kids, engage them, and get them moving. So now what we have to see is, can it grip them day after day? Can we develop all the various versions of this that are necessary for all the dimensions of learning? And there are incredible complexities that are left for us to conquer.
I'm Jim Bowl from Adaptive Curriculum, an education company here at Sky. The other night, the president spoke a lot about, highlighted deficiencies in our math and science education, and how that's going to be really important if we want to continue to be competitive globally. And I know the companies here want to hire students with very good math and science backgrounds. What do you think that we'd have to do here in Arizona to strengthen those areas?
Yeah. Well, you know, and I talked about the National Assessment of Educational Progress. The federal government has spent billions of dollars over the last 40 years collecting that data. They pull a sample of 3,000 students in every state, and I think maybe even at every grade level in every state, or at the grade levels that they measure. And what they show is at the midpoint, we're getting about 10 points of academic. They have these psychometricians that do all this stuff in education have the yardstick of measurement. So they have a scale. And what it shows that at the midpoint of the academic mission, there's about 10 points of gain. Then if you analyze that very best state, maybe they're at 12 points. That's what it looks. So the variance from the average to the best is 2 points. What we've got to do is, the thing to understand in Arizona's education system, our students rank somewhere in the neighborhood of 42nd. But they rank 42nd on the very first day of kindergarten. So Massachusetts is up there with their 25, 30-point lead, and we're back here. And we actually gain on Massachusetts over the course of the career. So they still end up at number 1 in the last day of school, number 1 in NAEP scores across the whole nation, but they don't have the best schools. Their students actually lose ground from the very first day of kindergarten through 12th grade. They still get to claim first place because their demographic is higher, but they're at schools, it's a total illusion. Education is saturated with those illusions. Something that you see, something that you believe, something that's not really true. Massachusetts does not have the best schools in the nation. Rand doesn't. When they got done with their separating school effects from demographic effects, Massachusetts wasn't even the top 10. What we have to do to be competitive is we need to get our students from 42nd on the first day of kindergarten into the top 10 at the end of 12th grade. Is we can't just be number one, going from 10 points to 12. We have to go all the way up to 15. We have to have a huge gap between us and number two state. I'm confident that we can get there, that it is within our grasp. We have to show that by, I mean, if we could just replicate the Vail results as a school district, we could get there. We certainly could get there if we could replicate the Carpe Diem results in a single school. It's within our grasp. We believe we'll be able to easily get there if we can fully get all of our classrooms organized as organizations, not as just collections of individuals. So we've got a lot of work to do. It's a complex strategy, and I hope not too many of you are saying this guy's nuts, but
Hi, I'm Steve Bannock of the Gulliver Project. Question for you. I know there's a lot of compelling evidence that a hybrid e-learning paradigm can produce real return upon investments for the state as well as accelerate those learning curves. My question is, from what I know, there is definitely an uptick required in the beginning to start that process. And in the current budgetary environment, how do we start the process?
well, the interesting thing is Carpe Diem, which started this up, and I've had quite a number of conversations with the founder there. I mean, the typical charter school actually operates at about $1,800 less per year than the typical district school. So one of the things we have to do is show that Carpe Diem can be replicated. I'm the ultimate cynic when it comes to numbers. You know, even though I observed it, it makes sense to me, the design appears to be there. In the end, maybe that principal, the guy that founded that, is just incredibly visionary. And it was a little bit more, it's a hybrid, so they also had some classrooms there where they did some real interesting things. So there was a little bit more complex environment going on there, but they did it on a charter school budget. So now what we have to see is, can we replicate that? Can we turn them into the GE of education where they replicate that out? We also had a number of schools that weren't too far behind them that are using the traditional model. So we know that some of the schools are capable of inspiring just that traditional model to approach those kind of gains. So it's a combination thereof. But we know we have a lot of charter schools operating with almost $2,000 a year less that are achieving these kind of spectacular gains. So we can't use money as an excuse. We've got to find one way or another, focus resources on these schools that are doing these great gains, see if they can replicate the results and more, and then keep it going.
You've talked a lot about replication, and of course the education field is famous for having people that do really cool things, but having a challenge replicating this and scaling these reforms. A, do you believe replication is difficult, and whether you do or not, I'd be interested in understanding your analysis as to what would it take to actually, scale these results across the rest of the districts in Arizona, or more than.
Yeah, when I first got into the office, and started my evolution of thinking on what we have to do to achieve educationally, I came across an analysis by the name of Ed Sloat. He was a really good researcher, and he had done an actual versus expected analysis for all of our school districts. And it was like, I was really stunned because it was in like 8-point type on page 74, down at the bottom of the page, and it said Creighton's the #1 school district in the state, and Alhambra's number 3. Then it had some smaller school districts that could have been statistical illusion. Their student counts, their end counts were so small. So I went out to visit Don Covey out at Creighton, and you could immediately see what was going on there. Obviously, this was a leader, and not just a leader, an organizer, and he had inspired his principals. And it's interesting because he was the top, so he was at the top. But when he left, things didn't go so well at Creighton. It was person dependent. So that's why I talked to you about, we get this 1.5, but it turns out to be person dependent. My belief is that, for example, at Sedona, when the original superintendent left, they brought in another superintendent. And what we found out is that culture that had been produced by this elaborate system that we had imported from IBM and Microsoft and we found out it had a little bit of a bite, so promptly spit out 2 subsequent superintendents. But it kept right on, it keeps right on moving along. And so when you use these principles of total performance, when you put these things in place, it appears to be, you know, it's like our high performance organizations. The leadership plays a valuable role, but these fundamental systems can keep things going right on along even if you exchange leaders. And ideally, what it does is it produces its own leadership. The culture is so strong that it keeps popping people up. There's always plenty of people to move in to the top slot. So the answer is, historically, we haven't been able to do that replication, that when great leaders leave, you see a dissipation and a relapse to averages. But I believe that if we get people thinking systematically about education, that we will be able to replicate and move this stuff very quickly across the whole state. Now, I had a very bad experience with the performance systems at Sedona because there was a small district. The teachers' unions looked at it and they realized that you could do performance pay and it would work. The teachers at Sedona voted 70% to do all that. They voted to be peer evaluated every month. They voted to have pay that was linked to performance. And so when the teachers' union saw that, we go, oh, okay, we're okay with that. So then we moved it over, a very watered down version of it, over to the Mesa School District. And the teachers voted to do it there. And then we thought, wow, now we can blow it statewide through Prop 301. So we blew it statewide, total chaos. We thought, I was thinking, naive as I was, that these working models would propagate, these principles would propagate. Everybody relapsed to, when I first got that chairmanship of ed, I had them pull 700 research studies on the performance of performance pay in education. There were no working models. The whole state relapsed to all the stuff that has no history of working. So it really was chaotic. And I'm not a coercive kind of guy telling people how they have to do it, but I should have been a little bit more directive in how we rolled that out. Because we really sort of thought almost by osmosis that they would have heard about these things. What we found out is everything's in silos in education, and very few people know all that much about success stories elsewhere.
Hello. My name is Claire, and I come from London, and I'm part of a replication experiment, so this is very timely. I work with Trish on Starshine Academy, and hearing you speak and the way you talk, I would love to see whether you'd be interested to connect with leaders in the UK and see whether a partnership on replication experiments and what they know, people who think very much like you and bringing the business system into education would be of interest to you if we could organize a meeting for you or have you come over and meet some of those people.
Well, I'm interested in strategic advantage for Arizona. So I'm interested a little bit, but so I'm always willing to talk, and I have talked to a few of the people from England, but I'm always anxious to talk. Of course, my primary focus is I'm always a little bit apprehensive that somebody will take these ideas and make a success story out somewhere else faster than I can do it here.
John, thank you for being here today, and I really appreciate your leadership. I was really involved in the strategy of the Prop 301, and I think for many of us, and I know Ted felt the same way, we'd always used a lot of technology and knew that the schools would be jumping for joy when they were given free stuff, computers and all of that. And that was when I learned the most about K-12 education, that nobody wanted to do something different.
Yeah.
And so the resistance to, I went out to a few schools that literally was in trouble because they didn't take the computers out of the parking lot. And they wouldn't even just let the kids try them.
Oh.
So it's a human conditioning that's causing the kids to stay down. It's the leadership.
But there are some other issues as it relates to technology in the classroom too. I'm absolutely convinced that technology is going to be the breakthrough in education. So we just started on a search for where that breakthrough was, validating it, and then getting ready to move it through very quickly. And we went through piles of research studies. So, you know, and again, you have the illusion factor because everybody, don't throw any bricks at me. Everybody believes their product has great gains and has demonstrated those great gains. The challenge is that when you look very closely, we all don't even understand our own biases and how those biases act out when we go out and put systems in place. And so what you have to do in all this stuff is you have to sweep away the bias so you can get at real performance. And when we ground through that, we were having trouble finding stuff that was really having an impact over the traditional classroom. And there's an outfit called the Institute for Education Sciences in the Federal Department of Education. And they've been spending $20 to $30 million a pop to evaluate all kinds of initiatives in education that create greater academic gain. And it's been coming back 0, 0, 0, 0. They got to software. They did a very sophisticated sweep of education software across the nation. Then they evaluated it through a random assignment technique. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of that random assignment technique, and I've taken a lot of time to understand those criticisms. Just me, I don't believe those criticisms hold up. So when they got done with software, they came back, they found one software that had a statistically significant impact, but not a practically significant impact. Now, they're now moving into round 2. They found a few more software packages, and they are finding they're finding 2 software packages. They're in mid-trial. They found 2 software packages that are having an outsized impact. And I got a chance to look at one of those last Friday. They call it a graphical and temporal, it's mathematics. And you could see why it had an impact. So we're finding it very fascinating. So the same way that we're working to do math, we might try to combine it with our organizational stuff and give it a test so that you're doing a graphical path and also a digital path in mathematics. So, you know, I hear what you say, but it's part of the reason is people are looking for the killer application, and that really hasn't existed when you're subject to real rigorous scrutiny. We're just now seeing a glimmer now that perhaps we're going to get some breakthrough with the very latest in these developments. Hi, Ted.
Yeah, Ted Craver, ESATS. You've inherited a really interesting structure in Arizona called the Department of Education. About 600 employees, not known for innovation, at least according to most people I've dealt with it for 30-some years now. Although they've had some real wins in the past in a lot of different areas. How are you going to take what you learned in schools and maybe apply that to the Department of Education? You're interested in educational technology, but only about 1% of your staff deals with that on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
If we're going to transform with that, have you given some thoughts? I know you're holding off a bit on making major changes, but give some thoughts on redesigning the Department of Education to be more effective in this area?
Well, you know, I've been doing this stuff theoretically and also with legislation, you know, putting initiatives in place there to maximize this choice environment that I believe is critical for innovation. My own agency, I'm sort of in shock after, 17 days? Well, one of my shocks was to find out that I have 38 employees funded by the general fund. So that's half the employees at an elementary school. It's not statistically different than 0. I mean, our education system fluctuates by 38 employees probably every day. So it was a little bit of a shock to find out that I have 470 employees, but only 38 of those work for me, and the rest work for the federal government. So it is, you know, it's like, holy smokes. So that's not an excuse for failure to act, but it means that the creative challenge is all that much more all that much more challenging for what I have in front of me, because those 38 employees are all in little places where the house is burning down. We have a computer system that doesn't work, that doesn't serve schools well. So I'm talking about schools serving parents well and students well and degrees of excellence. We're about to crank up my customer satisfaction measures, and I think my excellence rating is going to be the goose egg. You know? So, you know, but the one advantage I have is there's no way but up. You know, so any performance I have is going to be regarded as an improvement. So we have just all kinds of organizational challenges right within my own agency that we, in a sense, have to solve before I can even start on too many initiatives. I'm fortunate to have a gentleman by the name of Elliot Hibbs. I don't know if I see a few heads shaking out there. Elliot Hibbs, getting him to come and work for me as Chief Operating Officer is like getting Michael Jordan to do my jump shots. He's that good. And so all I have to do is not interfere with him too much and take credit for everything. So he's doing the organizational side of it. He's very good at that, but he's got a very limited resource portfolio there. Meanwhile, we're actively talking to a lot of people, sort of laying the ground too. If some of these initiatives prove out, which we should know by the end of this semester, our math project, in the first time around, the data was off the charts. So we have to show it again. We have to show it with more students. Once we can absolutely have convincing proof, we think that school districts want this kind of thing, especially if it's more productive. If they can get the economies of scale necessary to give teachers a pay raise or not lay off teachers, there's going to be interest in it. But we have to be able to show clear breakthrough and clear evidence of that. And it's tough in the education environment. Just to illustrate how tough it is to understand the nature of data and evidence in education, consider what Florida did. They teamed up with the National Institute for Child Health and Development, the National Literacy Foundation, and the National Center for Education Statistics, and they spent millions of dollars doing research in reading. They went through 10,000 studies. 10,000. They found 456 that were worth the paper they were written on. So think about that. Extrapolate that out to all evidence in education. If somebody comes to you and says that they base their thinking on research, you know, their first thing that people do is, because there's a 96% chance that they're talking about research that isn't worth the paper. Now, the other 4.5%, they found it had significant methodological weaknesses. So they then engaged in a whole new research effort in punching through, why are we limited to 60% literacy rates in reading? Why has that been flatlined like that for 4 decades? And they were able to get profound understandings as to why that was so, and the actions you have to take to overcome that at a profound level. And you would think we know everything there is to know about teaching reading. Well, what they discovered is there are a lot of things that we don't know in our education culture, commonly understood among teachers, on how to improve reading outcomes. They moved their literacy rates 30% relative to Arizona using that fundamental base of knowledge. So the thing I would like to tell you all is that I apply the same level of scrutiny that Florida does when I'm making decisions. I don't believe any number I'm told, anything I hear. I've got to pound it, repound it, you know, slaughter it, because there have been too many fads that have ripped across education and done too much damage to teachers, and too many unthinking policymakers who have simplistic ideas. Education is an extraordinarily complex endeavor that demands that you have leaders that have a profound knowledge. And I don't even claim to have an absolutely profound knowledge, but I think I've endeavored into it a little deeper than a lot of the people I talk to. We had a school chiefs meeting, and I heard people talking around the table, and I'm thinking, well, I don't have a very high hurdle to clear. So anyway, there are some good people out there. The guy that's guiding Florida's effort, he's top-notch. Indiana, top-notch. So we're going to be working with them and talking to them about what we're doing, what they're doing, and you know. So it's great talking to a really high-octane group. I can actually say some of these things that I'm thinking without too much fear. Angel, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity
Thank you,
here.
and thank you to everyone.